Welcome to the UIAAA Connection podcast. Hometown Ticketing is proud to be the exclusive sponsor of the UIAAA Connection podcast and to provide schools nationwide with the best options for digital ticketing for their events. Visit their website at hometownticketing.com to learn how they can make digital ticketing possible and simple at your school. Thank you to Hometown Ticketing for their exclusive sponsorship of the UIAAA Connection podcast.
Welcome back to another edition of the UIAAA Connection. I'm your host, Mark Hutch Hunter. This is the final podcast of season 2, and we're happy to have as our guest today, Bruce Whitehead, CMAA, former executive director of the NIAAA. How are you, Bruce?
Doing very well, Mark. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Let's have you start by sharing with our audience where some stories of your youth, where you grew up, where you went to high school, college, maybe your first job, those types of things.
Well, I grew up in northern Indiana, in the rural areas outside of South Bend, Mishawaka. So I tell people I grew up in the shadow of the Golden Dome. But my father was a building contractor. My granddads were both farmers, so I spent a lot of my youth years working on the farm and went to a very small high school. There were 35 in my graduating class. I happened to be the last graduating class from this high school before it was absorbed in consolidations here in Indiana. Being a small school, obviously, we played every sport that was available. So I ran cross country in the fall because the basketball coach said we had to. Played basketball in the winter, and then in the spring, we had track in the early spring that ended about the 1st of May, and then we started playing baseball and played baseball through the middle of the summer. At that time in Indiana, there were no state championships. Indiana had no state tournaments. So you basically had your regular season, and that was pretty much it. But then I went off to Purdue University and I got a bachelor's and a master's from Purdue in mathematics. I said one interesting thing my freshman year of college is Indiana was on Palm Sunday, April 11th. Indiana was blitzed with about 25 tornadoes across the state. I was at Purdue in my freshman year, and we were not affected at Purdue University, but my father was in a car, Chrysler New Yorker that was 2 weeks old, that was actually picked up in the funnel and carried for about 3/4 of a mile before it was deposited. And our house was severely damaged. So my father was in the hospital and our house was severely damaged. So on Sunday night, I got a hold of the dean and I said, I'm going home. I don't know how long I'll be there. I hope you'll excuse my being gone. And he said, you go, you need to be at home. And I was really grateful for the dean understanding that I needed to be home. And I missed a week of class, but it all worked out. And then I graduated from Purdue and I took Air Force ROTC while I was at Purdue, 2 years of it. And then I had to make a decision whether to go advanced, which would mean at least 4 years in the Air Force, or whether to drop out. And I chose to not continue with ROTC. That was the era of Vietnam. We were heavily involved in Vietnam at the time. And so I chose not to. I graduated, and my draft, we were in the draft lottery at that time. Some people might remember that.
I remember it well. My number was 56.
My number was 54.
Ah, there you go.
But ironically, at that time, the draft Selective Service Administration sent me a letter and told me my number was 54 and I would probably be drafted. However, if I had signed a contract to teach math or science in high school, I should let them know, because they were deferring anyone who was a high school math or science teacher because there was such a shortage. I got a job at Crawfordsville, which was about a half hour from Lafayette, to teach math. And so because of that, I was deferred from the draft and never did go into the military because of the deferment, because I was a math teacher. So I graduated. My wife and I got married. She had 2 years left at Purdue. I got a job 30 minutes away. We lived in Lafayette, and I drove to Crawfordsville. That was my first job, teaching job, was in Crawfordsville, Indiana.
And it was your last teaching job also.
And it was my last teaching job. That's right. I spent 33 years at that school district, one school district. Another, I guess, positive is I got my bachelor's, and then I started teaching and got my master's through the summers and night schools. And because I was a math and science teacher at that time, the federal government had what they called National Science Foundation grants. I don't think they exist anymore. I'm sure they don't. But you could apply for a National Science Foundation grant, which I did, and my master's tuition was entirely paid for by this National Science Foundation grant. I didn't have to pay any tuition for my master's degree in mathematics, which was a nice blessing, because my teaching contract at that time was $6,300. That was my first contract. And my wife was still doing her bachelor's and master's work at Purdue. So we pretty well lived on $6,300 in our house trailer.
And in those days, I can remember my first job. I signed, I think, for $9,400 back in the summer of '79, and I thought, oh, I've made it. I actually have a real job now.
Yeah, you have a real job. And to think today to live on $8,000 is pretty remarkable.
Oh, absolutely. Well, share with our listeners, Bruce. Then you're at Crawfordsville. You spent your whole career at Crawfordsville, similar to my whole career at Jordan High here in Utah. And how do you go from being a math teacher, which I also was, to becoming the athletic director? And then we'll get to the NIAAA part later.
Well, my first year there, when I signed the contract, the superintendent told me that it was only a 1-year contract because I was replacing a teacher who was on sabbatical. He said if I performed well and that teacher chose not to come back, then I could be offered the job beyond the first year. So I took a gamble and took the job just to have a teaching job and income, as you said. And he chose not to come back. So in April of my first year of teaching, in that April, the principal called me down and said that the teacher I was replacing had chosen not to come back, and that if I wanted to continue there, the job was mine. And so that's how it all started out, being only 1 year guaranteed and ended up being 33. But the first 2 years, I just concentrated on teaching. Then the principal called me. The principal that hired me was only there 1 year, and then he left to go to the IHSAA. And so I had a new principal my second year. He was the vice principal that they had moved up, so I knew him. He called me into his office at the end of the second year, and he said, "I need a tennis coach for next year." Well, I was thinking about I'd always had an interest in athletics, played sports in high school, and I was looking for some coaching, but I wasn't thinking of tennis because I'd never been on a tennis court in my life. So he said, "I need a tennis coach." Well, a difference between early 1970s and today, you found a warm body. Today, you better have somebody that knows something about the sport. So he said, "I need you to take this job." And I said, "You don't want a tennis coach. If you hire me, you're hiring a tennis chaperone, not a tennis coach." So I was working on my master's at Purdue that summer. So I had a class with about two classes with about 2 hours in between. So every day I had class, I'd leave the first class, go to the Purdue library and read tennis books for 2 hours a day. And so I learned very early on when we started practice in the fall, they all got together, all the boys were together. And the fortunate thing for me the first year is we had 5 really great seniors who all played. And I just got the guys together and I said, gentlemen, I've been reading books all summer about tennis, but I'll be honest with you, I don't know a lot. I said, when it comes time to demonstrate strokes, one of you seniors is going to do the demonstration. I said, I'm very good at managing people, but I'm not very good at understanding the game of tennis. Strategy-wise, I think I can do okay. And we got along great. Those 5 seniors were the greatest kids you could ever have for a first-year coach that knew nothing about the sport. We had a winning season. They had a winning season. They won the conference. And I coached tennis for 4 years and had great players all the time I was there. The year after those seniors graduated, I had 3 brothers that were 6'7", 6'6", and 6'4". And it wasn't hard to coach those 3 brothers.
I'll bet.
They pretty well covered the court, but we got along well. And then I had an opportunity to get into junior high basketball, eventually moved up to varsity assistant. And I also had an opportunity to get in as assistant baseball coach. So I was coaching 3 sports by the 3rd year. And then in 1976, the principal called me in the spring. I was looking for a head basketball job. Everybody in the state of Indiana thinks they're a varsity basketball coach, and of course I did too.
Yeah.
And I had an interview set up in northern Indiana to coach varsity basketball, to be interviewed for a head varsity basketball job. Principal calls me in about the 1st of May, and he said, at that time we had a principal and we had an assistant principal athletic director. And then we had an athletic business manager. And that's what I was doing that at the time, get the tickets ready and those kinds of things. Sure. The athletic director did the scheduling, hired the officials and all that. Anyway, the principal called me in. He said, we need to take all the athletic responsibilities away from the assistant principal. It's getting to be too big a job. We're going to hire an athletic director that will take care of all of athletics, scheduling, everything. And he said, I'd like you to take the job. Now, mind you, I'm a 30-year-old pup, been teaching 7 years or 8. We've got a varsity football coach who's been a football coach for 25 years and been at Crawfordsville for 20-some years. We've got a very veteran seasoned guy. We've got a basketball coach who's in his late 40s, early 50s, who's been coaching basketball for years, very successful. And I said, you want me to take the AD job when you got those 2 guys on this staff? And he said, yeah. He said, we think you can do it. So I went home that night. I said to Pam, well, the principal, Don, offered me the athletic director's job today. And I said, what do you think? She didn't say much. About 5 minutes later, she said, do athletic directors get fired as much as basketball coaches do in Indiana? And I said, no, I rarely hear of an athletic director getting fired. And she said, why don't you take the job? So that's how it all came about. I gave up tennis coaching, baseball coaching, kept the basketball coaching for a few years before I gave it up. And then I still taught one class. I taught calculus class, first period in the morning, and I enjoyed that. And so I taught that one calculus class almost the rest of my career, and that's how it all started in 1976. At that time,
That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and the biggest thing at that time was Title IX. I took over in 76 and we had 9 sports. And by 1986, we had 20 sports. Yeah.
Bruce, why
So,
don't you, oh, go ahead and finish.
no,
Okay, well, why don't you share with our listeners in Utah and across the country one or two of the mentors you've had that helped you along your path to get to, obviously, eventually the director of the NIAAA.
yeah, that's obviously my mother and father were my two biggest mentors.
Sure.
From the time I was old enough to understand, my father would say to me, "When you graduate from high school, you're going to college." That wasn't an option that I had. My mother had a high school diploma. My father dropped out of school when he turned 16 to help his dad on the farm. That was in the Depression era. And so he was adamant that I was going to get a college degree. So it was never an option. They were great mentors to me. My grandfathers, both my sets of grandparents. I had a basketball coach my senior year of high school, was a great role model and had a big influence on me. And then when I got to Crawfordsville, I said the principal that hired me was only there 1 year, but he taught me more in that 1 year, I think, probably, than a lot of principals teach people in 10 or 12 years. Ward was a great first-year principal. For a first-year teacher, he was a super principal. And then he left to go to the IHSA and eventually became commissioner. So he can kind of continue to mentor me because I ended up doing some things later on in my career, and part of that I think was because of what Ward had done when he left Crawfordsville to go to the IHSAA. But Ward was he had the greatest integrity and honesty. He always told you where you stood. It was never tell you one thing and mean another thing. I remember one time, about 2 minutes before the bell rang, I walked out of my classroom and there was a drinking fountain about 10 paces away from my classroom door. And the students were studying. I walked out of my classroom, went to the drinking fountain, and the drinking fountain was located where the principal, if he came out of his office, could see you in the hallway. Mm-hmm. And I looked up and as I was getting a drink, and Ward was coming out of his office because it was about passing period time. And I went back to my classroom. That was in the middle of the week. And every Friday, Ward would, after school was out, maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes after school was out, he'd walk the halls. Our school was kind of in a circular pattern every Friday. And about every Friday, he would stop into my classroom. And he'd say, how'd it go this week? You know, and I know that was purposeful on his part, mentoring me as a first-year teacher. Well, this particular Friday, he stopped into my classroom and he didn't ask me how things went. He just, in his very stern voice, he said, "I don't want to see you at the drinking fountain before the passing period bell rings again."
And it is.
And he turned around and walked out. And but that was how he was. But it taught me so much that first year. So he was a great mentor to me.
Excellent. Well, now take us from, you're now the athletic director. It's in the late 70s. And obviously somewhere in there you got involved in the NIAAA, and then all of a sudden you're the NIAAA secretary, which is what you were the very first time I met you way back in 1998. So how does that happen that you got that secretary job?
Well, if I could lead up to it a little bit, Mark.
Sure.
In the late 70s, I got involved with the IIAA, the Indiana ADs. I went to we had district meetings like you do in Utah, I'm sure. And I went to a district meeting one day with and Bob, the former AD, who's still the assistant principal. Bob went with me because he knew a lot of people, had a lot of friends. And I said, Bob, you want to go with me to the district meeting today? Sure. And Bob was with me, and we're sitting at the district meeting, and it came time to nominate someone from our district to serve on the board of directors of the IIAAA. And lo and behold, this gentleman from Crispus Attucks High School here in Indianapolis nominated me. He was a good friend of my previous AD, who was also a mentor to me. He was a good friend of Bob's, and evidently he and Bob had talked about it. So he nominates me, this young pup that had been an AD about 3 years or 4. And lo and behold, I won the election. And so I go to this meeting not thinking anything, and I come away from this meeting being elected to the IIAAA board of directors.
Baptism by fire.
Well, that led to, in 83, 84, I became president of the IIAAA. And then I went through that process. And by 86, I was rotating off the IIAAA board, but I had been through the entire leadership chain there. And I applied for an NIAAA committee because I felt my involvement with IIAAA was winding down. So I applied for a IIAAA committee, and in 1988, I was appointed to the Communications, Issues, and Resolutions Committee that was active then, was discontinued in 2001, and now it's been revitalized.
Right.
So I was appointed to the Resolutions Committee, and the chair of that committee was Sister Lynn Windsor.
Okay.
And anybody that knows Sister Lynn knows that if you're on her committee, you better be a busy person, because she's going to demand a lot.
Absolutely.
And I served on the Resolutions Committee, and then she won the at-large election in Dallas in 1989 or 90. I think 19, yeah. And so
and I might add, they changed the at-large rules for the election after that, but go ahead.
That's
continue.
exactly right. She might have won the election with some controversy, kind of like we had in our presidential election last November. Anyway,
yeah,
that's another story. But so the Resolutions Committee needed a new chair, and I was appointed then chair of the Resolutions Committee. And that's where I was. She ascended to the leadership presidency of the IIAAA in 1994. And I was scheduled in 1994, I was scheduled to be the at-large candidate for the board of directors from Section 4.
Okay.
At that time, Section 4 and Section 5 had an at-large election. And in that December, I was scheduled to be the Section 4 candidate for the at-large. Well, at that time also in the NIAAA, the board of directors only met in July and December. The board of directors did not meet in February. The officers met in February, just the officers. And Art Newcomer, who had been the secretary treasurer of the NIAAA since the second year, Art was not the first year, but he was selected the second year and had served every year since 1978 till 1994. Art announced in February that this was his last year. 1994 would be his last year as secretary treasurer. And it was not an elected position at that time. It was an appointed position by the board.
Sure.
And so in February, when Art made that announcement to the officers, along with Frank Kovaleski, who was the NFHS liaison to the NIAAA, the officers and Frank were in Kansas City brainstorming a list of names, and my name was on that list, and they kept paring the list down. And about the middle of February, I get a phone call from Sister Lynn in my office at school, and she said, and I knew her, of course, having served under on the Resolutions Committee. She said, "Would you accept an appointment to the Secretary Treasurer of the NIAAA?" She said, "We did a nationwide list as officers, and your name came to the top. So I'm calling to ask if you would consider that. So again, it's history. I withdrew my name as a candidate for the board of directors and accepted the position of secretary beginning in December of '94. And Indiana chose Don Bales to run in my place for that at-large election, which he won and subsequently became very active in the NIAAA as well. So that's kind of how it all shook out. My first year, 1995, Tim Flannery was president.
Mm-hmm.
And I served as secretary then until 2001.
Okay, so did they just make another call because 2001 is when they moved from Kansas City to Indianapolis?
That's correct.
And so, so when you became the associate executive director, was that pretty much the same way that happened? Or was there an actual interview process?
No, yeah, it kind of happened the same way.
Well, because the logical is you'd been the secretary for so long.
Well, here's the NIAAA was growing in the late 90s. Not only growing, but leadership training, you know, started in 96.
Right.
And took off. And we added 2 levels of certification in 2000 and 2001. We added CMAA and RAA to the CAA. So we now had 3 levels of certification by 2000. Leadership training was just getting ready to skyrocket. And we needed more help in the office. And the board in July of 2000, the board told Frank, you need to interview and add another administrative assistant. And we got to San Diego in December of 2000, and I believe this is where we was in San Diego.
It was.
In December of 2000, and we got into the board meeting, and the first question the board asked Frank was, who's the new staff member? And he said, I haven't had time to interview anybody. We haven't got anybody on board yet. And the board just about went nuts. Frank, there's a lot of grumbling among the membership that we're not getting good service out of the NIAAA office. We need another staff person. And so I got to thinking at that board meeting as the secretary, treasurer. So I came home and I was going to be 55 that spring. I came home from that board meeting, talked to Pam again, and I said, we need help in the NIAAA office. I could take teacher retirement from Indiana, go to work for the NIAAA as an administrative assistant, because we need help in the office bad. And I knew that. And I knew well, and the other thing Frank said in San Diego, he said, if I hire someone, Bruce, you're going to have to come into the office and mentor them. He said, you're going to have to come into the office a lot and mentor them and train them. Because I pretty well knew how the office operated, having been secretary treasurer. And I told Pam, I said, if I'm going to have to go in and mentor this person, I might as well be the person. So I called Frank in late January and I said, can we meet for breakfast? So we met for breakfast and I pitched it to him. And he called me back a couple of weeks later and he said, come on over to the office and let's talk, you and I and Bob Canopy. Because things were a little different at that time. The NIAAA was a separate 501c3, but yet we were in the NFHS offices.
Right, in the basement.
And Frank felt that he needed Bob's approval before he hired anybody. So we had lunch together, and basically that's how it happened. There was never anybody else interviewed. I went to work as basically as an administrative assistant. The only criteria my wife had was between teacher retirement and what the NIAAA paid me, I had to be making as much as I was as AD.
There you go. There you go.
So, and it turned out that it was just a wash with my teacher retirement and what I made from the NIAAA, which wasn't a lot. So I went to work then in the NIAAA office, and that's how that started in 2001. And Frank was the NIAAA was growing so much that I think Frank was just uh, feeling a little sense of pressure. Um, Frank was feeling the growing pains, and we were in the Federation office, and Frank and Bob were not seeing eye to eye on all the things at that time. So in the spring of 2004, Frank announced that he was going to retire, and so he retired in December of 2004, and the new executive director took over in January of 2005. Now, Frank was paid by the National Federation. He was just a liaison. He wasn't considered the executive director of the NIAAA until August of 2004. Then the NIAAA started paying Frank's salary for those last 4 months as a changeover. I was the first NIAAA employee that was actually interviewed and hired by the NIAAA Board of Directors. Every previous employee of the NIAAA was not interviewed by the board or hired by the board.
And so then we go from there to it's 2005 January, and then how soon is the move up to Keystone? Because that happened right after you became the executive director.
January of 2005, and then I met with the board in February, told the board that we needed a second administrator. One wasn't enough. And so the board gave me permission to interview associate executive director position. And we interviewed 4 candidates for that, the president-elect, and myself. And we hired Mike Blackburn as the associate executive director from those 4 candidates we interviewed. And Mike came on board in June of 2005. And then we began talking to the board about our own office space pretty much at that July meeting in 2005. The move didn't actually happen until July of 2007. But the discussion started in July of 2005 at the July board meeting in 2005 because the Federation was growing. The NIAAA was growing.
The building is only so big.
And that building was only so big. And the NIAAA, we at that time had 3.5, myself, 2 other full-time and a part-time employee. We had 3.5 employees, and we had about less than 1,000 square feet of space that they could give us for our employees. And so obviously, if one of the organizations needed to move, it was the NIAAA, not the Federation. So we began in early 2006 looking for office space, and then talking about office space. And we talked in the February board meeting. We talked in the July of 2006 board meeting, and then in the February 2007 board meeting, we showed the board 5 different office spaces in Indianapolis area, and let the board decide which one they wanted of those 5. The staff narrowed it down from about a dozen to 5, and then the board chose the location where we're at today. That's the one the board chose, and it was a perfect location because the only thing that wasn't perfect about it was about 45 minutes from the airport.
From the airport, sure.
But we had 2 hotels within walking distance of the office.
Mm-hmm.
We had probably 30 restaurants within 2 miles drive of the office, and 4 or 5 within walking distance of the office. So we had everything we needed for an organization where most of our meetings were people coming from out of town. So we moved in June of 2007 into our own office space. A couple of other things that happened at the same time is we took over control of the IAA magazine.
Mm-hmm.
The Federation was doing that for us. We took over complete control of that. And then within 2 years after that move, we assumed equal partnership of the national conference, which prior to that, the Federation had been putting on most of the conference, and we assumed equal partnership in that and equal responsibility for that. So that all happened in that time span as well.
Excellent. And so that was right about the time of the partnerships, right about the time I came on the board in 2009.
Yeah.
January 2009, it was probably finishing that up. So talk for a minute, Bruce, about now that you're retired, you're the head of the IIAA, you're the executive director, but you've had a lot to do with the rise of the international program at the NIAAA. So speak to that for a few minutes.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm really proud of during my tenure as executive director, among other things, that and probably achieving accreditation is something that I'm really proud of, that we were able to accomplish, not because of what I did, but because what we were able to accomplish as an organization. But in probably 2012, there were 4 international schools. Well, back up a little bit. In 2009, about the time you came on the board, Canada approached us about our leadership training program, our certification program, specifically Alberta, Canada. And so the first thing we did as an organization is we helped Alberta, the province of Alberta, we helped them get organized as an AD association and to begin a leadership training program. We actually taught some of our classes up there until they could begin to write their own courses for Canadian ADs. But it all began in Alberta. And so I went to Alberta, I believe in 2009, when they taught the first leadership training courses ever in Canada. It was in Banff, Alberta, Canada. It was a tough place to go visit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I went up there and helped them teach those first courses, and they became organized. And now there's a national CIAAA, Canadian Interscholastic Athletic Administrators Association, and they're teaching. They've developed at least a dozen, if not more, courses. They're teaching leadership training all over Canada. And so that was the beginning. Well, from that, there were 4 international school athletic directors who were all in Middle Eastern or Middle European countries, approached us about, is there something we could do for international schools? International schools have sports in their school, but obviously international schools function entirely different than schools here in the States. So we began meeting with them in the summer when they were back in the States, because they all spent their summers here in the States. We met for them for probably 3 summers, and then we began mentoring them, and those 4 athletic administrators wrote 2 classes, 901 and 902, and actually 903. They wrote, over the course of the next couple of years, they wrote 3 classes. And we piloted those classes, Nashville in 2007? No, 17.
No, 17.
17.
Yeah.
We piloted 901 and 902 in Nashville in 2017 just to see how they would go over. And they were met with overwhelming approval. So beginning in 2018, then we added those 2 classes to our teaching at the conference, 901 and 902. Subsequent to that, we developed 903. Subsequent to that, we've developed 904, which is a legal class for internationals. And now we're teaching all 4 of those at the national conference. And we're in the process of writing a current issues course for international school ADs, 905, or 910, I'm sorry, 910. So we will have 5 classes by 2023. We'll probably, hopefully 2022, we'll have 5 international classes for international school ADs. And it has done a couple of things. It's increased our international membership, and it's increased our international attendance at the conference. So we're now reaching out to international school athletic administrators and trying to provide resources specific to their needs. And I'm still trying to help Phil and Mike a little bit by kind of overseeing that international program as it is right now.
And you're doing a great job. We're just about out of time, Bruce. Let me ask you this. If you could talk to a new athletic administrator, when I say new, I mean someone between 1 and 4 years. And if you could give them two suggestions that they would absolutely have to have in order to be a successful athletic administrator, what would that be?
Well, that's a good question, Mark. I think there's so many things. I think the first thing, and none of this probably has to do with the nuts and bolts of the job, because you'll learn the nuts and bolts of the job real quick. You may have to fly by the seat of your pants for a year or two, but if you've been involved in athletics, you'll learn the nuts and the bolts of the job very quick. But I think from my experience, one thing that I've always tried to be is I've always tried to be myself. I've not tried to be someone that I can't be. Mm-hmm. Too many times I think people get a job and they try and be somebody that they cannot be or should not be in that job. So I would say be yourself. Be open and honest at all times with people. Be straightforward with people. And lastly, I would say always try and do things right and always do the right thing.
Well said.
If you do those things, you'll be fine.
Very well said. Let me finish with this question then, Bruce. What question should I have asked you that I failed to ask you?
Oh, I think you were pretty thorough. I think if it would have been 25 years ago, you should have asked me about class sports in Indiana.
Ah, there you go.
Because in 1994, we did not have any class sports in Indiana. And I was on the IHSA board of directors, and I was asked to chair a committee to study the possibility of moving to class sports in Indiana, which we eventually did do in 1997, only in team sports. We still aren't classed in individual sports.
And you were the one that was burned in effigy when that came in.
I was the one that was burned. Myself and Bob Gardner, who was the commissioner of the IHSA at the time, then became executive director of the National Federation. But Bob and I were burned in effigy all across the state because we were going to destroy the sacred cow in Indiana of boys basketball.
Well, there you go. There you go. And they couldn't make another Hoosiers movie if you went into classifications.
And sometime when you need another podcast, Mark, I'd love to tell you, give you my presentation on Hoosiers, the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's good. We may have you on as another guest. And
because people that have seen the movie Hoosiers only have seen that side. They haven't seen the rest of the story.
There you go. Yeah. All right. I'll keep that in mind. That wraps it up for this week. Actually, that pretty much wraps it up for season 2 of the UIAAA Connection. Once again, our guest has been Bruce Whitehead, Certified Master Athletic Administrator. Thanks for being our guest today, Bruce.
Thanks for the opportunity, Mark. As you said, we've known each other for probably 25 years, and I cherish our friendship very much.
Well, I appreciate it, Bruce. For our listeners, we hope you tune in next week when we begin season 3 of the UIAAA Connection. We'll see you then.